We've already looked at modus ponens and modus tollens, two inferences that you can draw from a conditional statement, and then some additional information that acts as a trigger, allowing you to draw an inference, right? And now that we've come a long way from there and we've looked at some arguments in natural language, I want to show you another slightly different form of those two inferences, modus ponens and modus tollens. The distinction between the basic forms of modus ponens and modus tollens and the universal forms is something that I don't think other prep companies draw, and you may not have even realized that there is a difference when you've been working with these. But I think being able to see the distinction makes you much more confident in making your inferences. So we're going to try to give you the best understanding possible of what you're doing when you make these type of inferences. First, let's look at a typical modus ponens inference of the type we're pretty used to working with. Here we have a conditional. If neon is a noble gas, it'll be odorless. And then this tells us that the sufficient condition is true. Unqualifiably true, right? So we can confirm that the consequent, the necessary condition, is true as well. And we now know that neon will be odorless. So here's the inference we arrive at there. That's our modus ponens inference. The sufficient condition, we're told, is true in this additional piece of information here, so we can affirm that the necessary condition will be true as well. Neon is odorless. That's our inference. Now, universal modus ponens is slightly different. Here we're given a conditional rule that might apply to a lot of things. Look at this rule here. It's also a conditional rule, just a regular conditional rule. It says if an element is a noble gas, it'll be odorless. Now, the difference here is, whereas that other rule just gave us information about one thing, this rule here is talking about a bunch of things that might be noble gases. So we could make a bunch of different inferences potentially here, depending on information we get. So here, for example, we're told that xenon is a noble gas. Well, if an element is a noble gas, then it'll be odorless, according to this rule here. So we can infer that xenon is odorless as well. And we can change this to any sort of thing to which this rule applies. As long as it's a noble gas, this rule is going to apply to it. So here I made it argon, and if argon is a noble gas, well then we know it has to be odorless. Similarly, if we change it to helium, but we're told it's true that helium is a noble gas, we can draw the same inference. This rule applies universally to anything that is a noble gas. This is why we call it a universal modus ponens inference, because we get a rule that could apply to a wide range of things, and as long as you know that it applies, then you can always draw that inference with this rule. It's a subtle distinction, right, between proving the entire sufficient condition true, which is what we see with regular modus ponens, and just getting a piece of information where, we know it's true at least for this one thing, right? So it's a subtle distinction, but I want people to be aware that this type of inference, where you're taking, just a very specific little piece of information and pulling an inference out of it, is possible. Again, this is a very subtle concept, so I want people to go over the text lesson very carefully here. Make sure you understand the distinction between universal modus ponens and modus tollens and the regular forms. And at the end of the lesson, we'll give you some practice with making these inferences yourself.